Jesus is called the Son of God, the Messiah, the Lord, and the Word made flesh. But when Jesus talks about himself in the Gospels, one title appears again and again, the Son of Man. At first, that sounds almost like a step down. If Christians believe Jesus is the Son of God, why would he keep choosing a title that sounds so ordinary, so human, and so much less impressive? The answer becomes especially strange when you notice where Jesus uses it. The Son of Man forgives sins. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. The Son of Man must suffer, be rejected, die, and rise again. And then, at the moment of his trial, Jesus says that his accusers will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. That final statement is so serious that the high priest tears his robes. So what did Jesus mean by this title? Was he simply emphasizing that he was human? Was he hiding his identity? Was he quoting an ancient prophecy? And why could a phrase that sounds humble become one of the boldest claims Jesus ever made? To answer that, we have to begin with a fact that is easy to miss. Son of Man did not always mean the same thing in the Bible. In ordinary biblical language, a son of man can simply mean a human being. The expression can highlight human weakness, mortality, or creaturely status. The clearest example is the prophet Ezekiel. Again and again, God addresses Ezekiel as Son of Man. In that setting, the phrase does not make Ezekiel a heavenly king. It reminds us that Ezekiel is a human messenger standing before the God who sends him. That background matters because it means Jesus did not invent the words. A Jewish listener could hear Son of Man and recognize language that belonged to Scripture. But that still does not explain why Jesus used it so consistently for himself, because another biblical passage gives the expression a dramatically different setting. That passage is Daniel chapter 7. Daniel sees a night vision in which 4 terrifying beasts rise from the sea. They represent kingdoms, violent, arrogant human empires portrayed not as truly human, but as monstrous. One is like a lion, another like a bear, another like a leopard, and the fourth is so dreadful that Daniel struggles to describe it. These kingdoms dominate, devour, crush, and boast. Then the scene changes. Daniel sees thrones set in place, and the Ancient of Days takes his seat. The beasts are judged. Their power is stripped away. And after the beastly kingdoms comes a figure described as one like a son of man. In other words, someone who looks human. This human-like figure comes with the clouds of heaven and approaches the Ancient of Days. He is given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. Peoples, nations, and languages serve him. And unlike the kingdoms represented by the beasts, his dominion does not disappear. His kingdom is everlasting. That is the first major payoff in this investigation. When Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, the phrase can sound humble if we hear only the ordinary meaning, human being. But Daniel 7 gives us a second set of associations. A human-like ruler, the judgment of beastly kingdoms, heavenly clouds, universal authority, and an everlasting kingdom. And the contrast inside Daniel 7 is crucial. The empires that claim to rule the world become less than human. They become beasts. Then a truly human figure appears and receives the kingdom from God. The vision is about more than a mysterious title. It asks what genuine human rule is supposed to look like. There is an important detail here that we should not flatten. In Daniel's own vision, interpreters debate exactly how the one like a son of man relates to the holy ones, who later receive the kingdom. Some understand the human-like figure primarily as a representative of God's faithful people. Others see an individual heavenly or messianic ruler who represents them. The text itself connects the figure and the people closely enough that we should not pretend the question is simple. But for our purpose, one fact is clear. Daniel 7 created a powerful biblical image of human rule vindicated by God after the judgment of violent kingdoms. And when the Gospels place Daniel 7 language on Jesus' lips, especially language about clouds, authority, and judgment, the connection is difficult to miss. There is another detail that makes Daniel's vision even more striking. In the Old Testament, clouds are frequently associated with God's own presence and movement. God leads Israel in cloud. His glory appears in cloud. Poetic texts describe the Lord as riding on the clouds. So when Daniel sees a human-like figure coming with the clouds of heaven, the imagery is unusually exalted. We have to phrase that carefully. Daniel distinguishes the Ancient of Days from the one like a son of man. The vision is not simply saying they are the same figure, but the Son of Man is brought into a sphere of authority and glory far beyond an ordinary earthly king. That tension, human and yet exalted, distinct from God and yet sharing in divine rule, is exactly the kind of tension that reappears when Jesus uses the title. Now look at the first major way Jesus speaks about the Son of Man in the Gospels: present authority. In Mark chapter 2, some men bring a paralyzed man to Jesus. The house is so crowded that they cannot get through the door, so they open the roof and lower the man down. Jesus sees their faith and tells the paralyzed man that his sins are forgiven. The teachers of the law immediately recognize the problem. Forgiveness is not merely a medical claim. They ask in their hearts, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Jesus responds by healing the man, but listen to how he explains the miracle. He says that they may know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. That phrase is doing more than identifying the speaker. The issue in the scene is authority. Who has the right to forgive? Who has the right to say that a person's guilt before God is removed? Jesus answers the challenge by speaking about the authority of the Son of Man. If the title only meant, "I am a human being," the statement would become more confusing, not less. Why would an ordinary human claim authority to forgive sins in response to the objection that such authority belongs to God? But if Daniel 7 is hovering in the background, the language of authority begins to make sense. The Son of Man is the one to whom God gives dominion. The same chapter gives us another example. Jesus' disciples pluck grain on the Sabbath. The Pharisees object. Jesus responds by pointing to Scripture, declaring that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, and then saying, "So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again, the title appears at the moment of authority. Forgiveness, Sabbath. Both are areas where Jesus does not merely offer an opinion. He speaks and acts with startling jurisdiction. But then the title moves in a completely different direction. Jesus says the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. That is not the picture of a triumphant ruler receiving universal dominion. It is the picture of homelessness, rejection, and vulnerability. And that is the first clue that Jesus is doing something more complex than simply taking Daniel's glorious figure and attaching the title to himself. He is joining glory and humiliation. That becomes unmistakable after Peter's confession. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus asks his disciples who people say he is. They give several answers. Then he asks, "Who do you say I am?" Peter answers, "You are the Messiah." That sounds like the moment when everything should become clear. The disciples have finally identified Jesus correctly. But immediately after Peter's confession, Jesus begins teaching that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, be killed, and after 3 days, rise again. Peter cannot accept it, and that reaction tells us something important. Whatever Peter expected the Messiah to do, suffering and execution did not fit easily into the picture. Jesus does not abandon the language of kingship. He does not say Peter was wrong to call him Messiah. Instead, he redefines what his messianic mission will look like by speaking of the Son of Man. The Son of Man will suffer. This is one reason the title is so powerful in Jesus' teaching. It gives him room to hold together truths that the disciples keep trying to separate: authority and suffering, kingdom and rejection, glory and death. The disciples want a ruler without a cross. Jesus keeps telling them that the Son of Man's road to glory passes through suffering. A few verses later, Jesus says that whoever is ashamed of him and his words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Now the same title points forward to glory and judgment. So within one section of Mark, the Son of Man must suffer and die, and the Son of Man will come in glory. That is not accidental. It is the pattern. The title becomes a bridge between the humiliation of Jesus and the exaltation of Jesus. And this pattern keeps appearing. In Mark chapter 9, Jesus again teaches that the Son of Man will be delivered into human hands, killed, and rise after 3 days. In Mark chapter 10, he predicts his suffering again. Then James and John ask for the places of honor when Jesus comes in glory. They still imagine the kingdom in terms of status. Jesus answers by turning greatness upside down. Among the nations, rulers lord it over others. But among his followers, greatness means service. Then Jesus gives one of the most important Son of Man statements in the entire gospel. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Notice what has happened. Daniel 7 describes a Son of Man who receives service from peoples, nations, and languages. Jesus says the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. That is not a contradiction Jesus is embarrassed about. It is the heart of his mission. The one who receives the kingdom gives himself. The one who possesses authority uses that authority to serve. The one who will be exalted accepts humiliation. The human ruler who defeats the beastly way of empire does not become another beast. This is where the phrase begins to connect with the larger biblical story. Genesis says humanity was created in God's image and commissioned to rule over creation under God. Human beings were meant to exercise a kind of royal vocation. But throughout the Bible, human rule becomes corrupted by violence, pride, idolatry, and domination. Daniel 7 turns that corruption into a visual symbol. Human empires become beasts. Then one like a human receives the kingdom. Jesus takes that human vocation and carries it through obedient suffering. He does not conquer by imitating the beasts. He defeats sin and death through self-giving obedience. That does not mean Daniel 7 by itself predicts every detail of the cross. It does not. We are now seeing how Jesus' use of the title brings Daniel's vision into conversation with his own mission, and with other biblical themes of suffering, sacrifice, and faithful obedience. And this is where another question appears. If Son of Man can point to Daniel 7, why did Jesus not simply explain all of this directly? Why not say, "I am the Daniel 7 figure"? Why use language that could sound ordinary? We cannot know every motive behind Jesus' wording, and we should avoid pretending that scholars agree on a single psychological explanation. But we can observe what the title accomplishes in the gospel narratives. It reveals Jesus gradually. It forces listeners to pay attention to what he does with the title. And it lets Jesus define his identity through a story rather than through a slogan. The word Messiah could carry many expectations. Different Jewish groups imagined God's deliverance in different ways. Some expected royal restoration. Some emphasized priestly hopes. Some expected heavenly intervention. There was no single simplistic checklist shared by every Jewish person in the first century. So it would be too easy to say, Jesus avoided Messiah because everyone thought Messiah meant exactly one political thing. History is more complicated than that. But in the Gospels, whenever the disciples begin filling Jesus' identity with their own expectations, Jesus repeatedly corrects them by describing the path of the Son of Man. Peter says Messiah. Jesus says suffering. James and John imagine status. Jesus says service. Crowds want signs and power. Jesus speaks of rejection, death, resurrection, and future judgment. The title becomes a container Jesus fills with his own mission. And then we reach the midpoint of the story, where the scale of the question changes. The Son of Man is not only a title that tells us who Jesus is, it tells us what kind of kingdom God is bringing. Remember Daniel's beasts. The beastly kingdoms dominate through violence. The Son of Man receives an everlasting kingdom from the Ancient of Days. Now remember Jesus. The Son of Man has authority to forgive sins. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man serves. The Son of Man gives his life. The Son of Man is rejected. The Son of Man rises. The Son of Man comes in glory. This is a complete reversal of the normal pattern of power. In ordinary kingdoms, power is used to avoid suffering. In Jesus' kingdom, the king accepts suffering to rescue others. In ordinary kingdoms, rulers demand service. The Son of Man serves. In ordinary kingdoms, authority is protected through force. Jesus exercises authority by forgiving, healing, restoring, and ultimately giving his life. Daniel's human ruler stands in contrast to beasts, and Jesus' life shows us what non-beastly rule looks like. That is a larger payoff than simply decoding a title. Jesus is not only claiming to be the ruler of Daniel 7, he is revealing the character of the ruler. But we still have not reached the most explosive use of the title. For that, we have to go to Jesus' trial. In Mark chapter 14, Jesus is brought before the Jewish council. Witnesses accuse him. Testimony conflicts. Finally, the high priest asks him directly, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus answers, "I am." And then he adds words that are more important than the simple answer. He says, "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." This sentence combines two enormous Old Testament images. The first comes from Psalm 110. The Lord says to my Lord, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." The second comes from Daniel 7. The one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven and receiving everlasting dominion. Jesus places those images together and applies them to himself. Now the title can no longer be reduced to "I am just a man." Jesus is standing powerless before human judges, but he tells them that the courtroom will be reversed. They see a prisoner. He tells them they will see the Son of Man at the right hand of power. They are judging him. He invokes the vision in which God judges the beastly powers and gives the kingdom to the human-like ruler. They are preparing to condemn him. He speaks as the one who will be vindicated. And Mark tells us the high priest tears his garments and says they have heard blasphemy. Whatever exact legal and theological categories we use to explain that reaction, the narrative wants us to understand that Jesus' words are not heard as a modest claim. This is the largest payoff of the title. Son of Man sounds lower than Son of God, only if we remove it from the biblical story Jesus is invoking. At his trial, it becomes a claim about vindication, authority, heavenly enthronement, and judgment. There is another subtle point in Daniel 7 that is worth noticing. People often hear "coming with the clouds" and immediately imagine the Son of Man traveling from heaven down to earth. Later New Testament passages can certainly use cloud imagery in connection with Jesus' future return. But in Daniel's original vision, the movement is toward the Ancient of Days. The human-like figure comes into the heavenly court and receives the kingdom. That means Daniel 7 is not only about arrival, it is about enthronement. Jesus' trial statement brings together being seated at God's right hand and coming with the clouds. In other words, the man being condemned is claiming that God will vindicate and exalt him. The cross is not the end of the story. Resurrection and exaltation are the divine verdict. This helps explain why the Son of Man's sayings fall into several different groups. Some describe Jesus' present authority. Some describe his suffering. Some describe his future or heavenly glory. Scholars have long debated how these groups relate historically, how the underlying Aramaic expressions may have functioned, and whether every Son of Man saying goes back to exactly the same stage of the tradition. Those are real questions. But if our question is how the four canonical Gospels present Jesus, the pattern is unmistakable. The same self-designation holds together all three movements: authority in the present, suffering before vindication, glory after suffering. And those three movements explain each other. If we only focus on glory, we misunderstand Jesus' kingdom as raw power. If we only focus on suffering, we reduce Jesus to a tragic victim. If we only focus on present authority, we miss the cross and the final kingdom. The Son of Man is the one whose authority is revealed through the path of suffering and vindication. Now we can revisit the most obvious interpretation. Does Son of Man mean Jesus is human? Yes. At minimum, the words are human language. They can evoke humanity, and the Gospels are not embarrassed by Jesus' genuine human life. He gets tired, he eats, he sleeps, he suffers, he dies. Christian theology should never use Daniel 7 to erase Jesus' humanity. But saying Son of Man means Jesus is human is not enough. If that were the whole point, it would not explain the Daniel 7 allusions, the cloud imagery, the authority to forgive sins, the lordship over Sabbath, the final judgment sayings, or the trial scene. The title can affirm humanity, while also carrying a much larger scriptural claim. In fact, that combination may be exactly the point. The ruler in Daniel 7 is human-like in contrast to beasts. Jesus is genuinely human, yet he is the human who receives God's kingdom, exercises divine authority, and is enthroned beside God. The title does not force us to choose between humanity and exaltation. It places them together. That matters because the New Testament does something similar elsewhere. Paul can call Jesus the last Adam, presenting him as the representative human who succeeds where Adam failed. Hebrews can quote Psalm 8, "What is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you care for him?" And then speak about Jesus crowned with glory and honor after suffering death. We should be careful not to pretend every occurrence of Son of Man in the Old Testament is a direct prophecy of Jesus. Psalm 8 is about humanity's vocation. Ezekiel's title identifies a human prophet. Daniel 7 gives us the apocalyptic human-like ruler. But together, these texts create a larger biblical theme. What humanity was made to be, what human rule became, and what faithful human rule looks like when restored under God. Jesus stands at the center of that story. This also helps explain why Son of Man is not simply interchangeable with Son of God. Son of God has its own rich biblical background. Israel can be called God's son. The Davidic king can be called God's son. In the Gospels, the title comes to express Jesus' unique relation to the Father in ways that go far beyond those earlier uses. But Son of Man brings a different set of biblical images: humanity, Daniel's kingdom, suffering, vindication, clouds, judgment, a ruler who represents his people, a truly human king in contrast to beastly empires. So asking why Jesus says Son of Man instead of simply repeating Son of God is a little like asking why a story uses more than one image for the same person. Each title reveals something the others do not reveal in exactly the same way. Jesus is not choosing between being Son of God and Son of Man. The Gospel writers present both as necessary for understanding him. The question is what Jesus accomplishes by repeatedly putting Son of Man in his own mouth. One answer is that it keeps the reader from separating his identity from his mission. You cannot hear Jesus say Son of Man for long without hearing about authority, suffering, resurrection, and glory. The title moves. It has a narrative built into it. And one of the most important movements is from hiddenness to revelation. During much of Jesus' ministry, people argue about who he is. Some call him prophet. Some wonder whether he is Messiah. Demons recognize him in ways crowds do not. Disciples confess him and then immediately misunderstand what his mission requires. But at the trial, the Son of Man language reaches its climax. The title that could sound ambiguous in ordinary conversation is now attached openly to Psalm 110 and Daniel 7. The hidden king speaks the language of enthronement. Then he is crucified. And this creates one of the great ironies of the gospel. The people mocking Jesus think the cross proves he cannot be king. But Jesus has already told his disciples that the suffering of the Son of Man belongs to the path. The shameful death does not refute the title. It fulfills the pattern Jesus has been teaching. That does not mean Daniel 7 itself says the Son of Man will be crucified. Again, we should not force one passage to contain the entire gospel. The point is that Jesus combines the Danielic destiny of the Son of Man with the suffering mission he repeatedly announces. The kingdom comes through a crucified and risen king. And now the title has a consequence for discipleship. Immediately after Jesus predicts the suffering of the Son of Man in Mark 8, he calls the crowd and says that anyone who wants to follow him must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow. That sequence matters. The Son of Man is not only a doctrine to decode. His path becomes the pattern for his followers. If the king reaches glory through faithful suffering, his disciples should not expect the kingdom to look like a shortcut to status. If the Son of Man uses authority to serve, his followers cannot define greatness by domination. If the Son of Man gives his life for others, discipleship cannot be reduced to securing personal religious benefits. The title exposes the character of the kingdom. And that brings us back to Daniel's beasts. The question of Daniel 7 is not only who will rule, it is also what kind of rule will finally be human. The beasts are powerful, but they are dehumanized. They conquer, consume, and exalt themselves. The Son of Man receives authority from God. Jesus then shows us that this authority is expressed in forgiveness, healing, service, sacrifice, truth, judgment, and finally, resurrection life. The biblical answer to beastly power is not weakness. It is a different kind of kingship. This is one reason Jesus' title matters far beyond a vocabulary lesson. If we hear Son of Man and think it is merely Jesus' way of saying, I am human, we miss the kingdom. If we hear it only as an exalted heavenly title and forget his suffering, we miss the cross. If we hear only the cross and ignore his future authority, we miss the throne. Jesus holds all three together. Now consider another scene near the end of Matthew's Gospel. Jesus describes the Son of Man coming in glory and sitting on his glorious throne. The nations are gathered before him, and judgment follows. Whether we focus on the imagery of sheep and goats or the broader theme, the role is unmistakable. The Son of Man acts as universal judge. That is Daniel 7 territory again. Kingdom, nations, judgment, authority. And yet the judge is the same Son of Man who said he came to serve and give his life. This produces a remarkable Christian claim. The one who judges the world is not a distant ruler who has never suffered. The judge bears the story of rejection, service, and self-giving love. The crucified one is the enthroned one. The servant is the king. The Son of Man is both. That connection also changes how we think about Jesus' humanity. Christian teaching sometimes treats Jesus' humanity as though it were merely the temporary clothing of his divinity, something necessary for Bethlehem and the cross, but less important afterward. The New Testament does not speak that way. Jesus rises bodily. The risen Jesus remains the one who was crucified. Acts describes Jesus as exalted. Stephen, at the moment of his death, looks into heaven and says he sees the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. That is one of the few places outside Jesus' own speech where the title is directly applied to him. And notice the setting. Stephen sees the human figure in heavenly glory. Daniel 7 and the Gospel story converge. The Son of Man has passed through suffering and stands vindicated in the presence of God. Revelation later uses related one like a Son of Man imagery in its visions of the glorified Christ. So the title does not disappear after the resurrection, because Jesus has somehow outgrown humanity. His exaltation is the exaltation of the faithful human king. One more gospel scene helps tie these threads together. Jesus' teaching about the future in Mark 13. After describing upheaval, persecution, and the shaking of established powers, Jesus says people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and that he will gather his elect. That language sounds familiar because it is meant to. The clouds take us back to Daniel 7, but now the image is joined to the gathering of God's people. The one who was rejected by rulers becomes the ruler under whom the scattered people of God are gathered. This is important because it shows that Jesus did not reserve the title for one narrow subject. He did not use Son of Man only when talking about his humanity, or only when predicting the cross, or only when speaking about the end. The same title travels through the entire arc of the gospel. Before the cross, the Son of Man exercises authority. At the cross, the Son of Man gives his life. After rejection, the Son of Man is vindicated. In the future, the Son of Man appears in glory and gathers his people. That repeated movement also explains why simply replacing the phrase with Messiah every time would lose something. Messiah tells us Jesus is God's anointed king. Son of Man, as Jesus uses it, makes us watch how that kingship moves from earthly ministry through suffering to heavenly vindication and final rule. And there is a personal edge to that future language. Jesus is not discussing clouds merely to satisfy curiosity about prophecy. In Mark 8 and Mark 13, the coming glory of the Son of Man creates a decision in the present. What people do with Jesus now is connected to what will be revealed about him later. The teacher who can be ignored, rejected, or shamed in the present is the ruler whose identity God will publicly vindicate. And that brings us to one of the deepest whole Bible implications. The story begins with humans created to image God and rule his world under him. That vocation is corrupted. Empires become beasts. Israel waits for God's kingdom. Daniel sees a human-like ruler receiving everlasting dominion. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. He exercises authority. He serves. He suffers. He rises. He is enthroned. And the New Testament says those who belong to him will share in his reign. This does not make believers mini-messiahs. It means the human vocation is restored through union with the true King. The Son of Man does not merely save human beings from being human. He restores what faithful humanity was meant to become under God. That is why the title can be both humble and majestic at the same time. Man reminds us of creaturely humanity. Daniel 7 shows humanity exalted by God. Jesus' life shows humanity faithful to God. The cross shows humanity obedient even in suffering. The resurrection shows humanity vindicated over death. The ascension shows humanity brought into heavenly rule. And the kingdom promises that this story will finally transform the world. There is still one objection we should address. Some people hear all of this and say, if Daniel 7 is so important, would Jesus' original audience really have understood the reference? The answer is, not necessarily every time, and not necessarily every person. The Gospels themselves repeatedly show people misunderstanding Jesus. A biblical allusion does not require every listener to decode it instantly. In fact, part of the narrative effect is that the meaning becomes clearer over time. A phrase can begin as a question. Then Jesus attaches authority to it. Then suffering. Then resurrection. Then clouds and glory. Finally, at the trial, the Daniel 7 connection becomes explicit enough that the stakes can no longer be ignored. The disciples understand Jesus retrospectively through the resurrection and the scriptures. That is how many biblical themes work. They are not always delivered as dictionary definitions. They develop through repeated use, story, allusion, conflict, and fulfillment. Another objection goes in the opposite direction. Some Christians say, Son of Man is obviously a divine title, so every use means Jesus is directly saying, I am God. That goes too far in the other direction. The phrase itself is not a magic code that always means God. Ezekiel proves that. Ordinary human usage proves that. Even Daniel 7 requires interpretation. The strength of Jesus' claim comes from the way he uses the title in specific contexts and the scriptural images he attaches to it. When he says the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, the context matters. When he says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, the context matters. When he predicts the Son of Man's suffering, the context matters. When he speaks of clouds, glory, angels, judgment, and sitting at God's right hand, Daniel 7 and Psalm 110 matter. We should resist both reductions. Not Son of Man simply means human. Not the phrase itself automatically means God. The Gospels build the meaning through the story, and this makes Jesus' choice of title remarkably effective. It is familiar enough to enter the conversation without explaining everything at once. It is scriptural enough to carry deep associations. It is flexible enough to connect present authority, suffering, and future glory. And it is rich enough to reveal Jesus as the faithful human ruler who receives God's kingdom without becoming another beastly king. Now ask the original question again. Why did Jesus call himself the Son of Man? Because the title allowed him to say something larger than, "I am a man," and something more precise than simply repeating a label others could misunderstand. In the Gospels, the Son of Man is the one who has authority on earth. He is the one who suffers. He is the one who serves. He is the one who gives his life. He is the one who rises. He is the one who is vindicated. He is the one who comes in glory. He is the one who receives the kingdom. He is the one who judges. And all of those statements belong to the same person. That is the key. Jesus does not use the title to hide either his humanity or his glory. He uses it to hold them together through the story of the cross and the kingdom. The title that sounds like the least impressive one becomes the title capable of carrying almost the entire shape of his mission. And once you see that, several gospel scenes begin to read differently. When the paralytic is lowered through the roof, the question is not merely whether Jesus can perform a miracle. The Son of Man is demonstrating authority to forgive. When Jesus speaks about Sabbath, the issue is not only a debate about rules. The Son of Man claims lordship. When Peter rejects the idea of a suffering Messiah, Jesus does not surrender the kingdom. He explains the road the Son of Man must walk. When James and John want honor, Jesus shows that the Son of Man rules through service. When Jesus stands before the council, he is not simply a defeated teacher answering charges. He invokes Daniel's human-like ruler and the enthroned Lord of Psalm 110. And when the cross comes, the apparent defeat is already inside the story Jesus has been telling. The Son of Man must suffer. Then he will be vindicated. This is also why the resurrection is not an optional happy ending attached to Jesus' moral teaching. If Jesus is the Son of Man of this story, resurrection is the reversal of the human court's verdict. Human rulers condemn him. God vindicates him. The beasts appear to win. The truly human king is raised. Death appears to end his claim. God enthrones him. That is kingdom language, and it is gospel language. For a Christian viewer, the personal consequence is not only that we now possess a more accurate definition of an ancient title. It changes the Jesus we think we are following. If our image of Jesus includes glory but not service, it is incomplete. If it includes compassion but not authority, it is incomplete. If it includes suffering but not judgment, it is incomplete. If it includes divinity but treats his humanity as unimportant, it is incomplete. If it includes humanity but strips away the Daniel 7 kingdom claim, it is incomplete. The Son of Man holds these dimensions together, and his path also corrects the way Christians imagine power. The kingdom of Jesus is not beastly power baptized with religious language. Its king does not use people to protect himself. He gives himself for people. He does not deny authority. He redefines how holy authority is exercised. He does not avoid judgment. He becomes the judge who first endured injustice. He does not reject glory. He reaches glory through obedience to the Father. That pattern does not mean Christians should romanticize suffering or refuse to resist evil. Jesus confronts evil directly. The point is that his kingship is not built on the same logic as the beasts. The world repeatedly tells us that being powerful means dominating, controlling, humiliating, or consuming rivals. The Son of Man shows another way. He has authority to forgive. He uses greatness to serve. He conquers through faithful self-giving, and God vindicates him. So when Jesus says the Son of Man, the phrase is not small. It is the story of what true humanity looks like when God's kingdom arrives. There is a reason the title can appear beside a homeless teacher with nowhere to lay his head and beside a heavenly ruler coming with clouds. Both are Jesus. There is a reason it can appear in a prediction of execution and in a vision of final judgment. Both belong to the same mission. There is a reason Jesus can say the Son of Man came to serve, and also say the Son of Man will sit on a glorious throne. The throne does not cancel the service. The service reveals the King, and that may be the most important correction of all. The title Son of Man does not lower Jesus beneath the story Christians tell about him. It gives that story its shape: humanity, authority, service, suffering, resurrection, vindication, kingdom, judgment, glory, all carried by the title Jesus chose to use for himself again and again. So the next time you read the Gospels and Jesus says, "the Son of Man," do not move past it as though it were merely another way of saying "I." Ask what is happening in the scene. Is authority being claimed? Is suffering being predicted? Is service being defined? Is Daniel 7 being echoed? Is glory being promised? That question will often reveal why the title appears exactly where it does. And when you reach Jesus' trial, remember where the story began. A phrase that sounded almost ordinary. Son of Man. Then the clouds appear. The throne appears. The right hand of God appears. The courtroom reverses, and the prisoner tells his judges that God will have the final verdict. That is why Jesus called himself the Son of Man. Not because Son of God was false, not because he wanted to deny who he was, but because Son of Man brought together the biblical story of humanity, kingdom, suffering, and glory in a way no single modern slogan can capture. The Son of God came as the Son of Man. The true human king took the road of the servant. The rejected one was vindicated, and the kingdom Daniel saw belongs to him. If you want to see how this connects to another question about Jesus' identity, why Jesus, if he is divine, prays to the Father? That is the natural next step, because the Gospels do not flatten Jesus into one simple category. They place his humanity, divine authority, relationship with the Father, suffering, and glory together. And once those pieces are allowed to remain together, the titles of Jesus stop competing with one another. They begin telling one story. And that is the final irony of the title. The words that sound most obviously human become the place where the gospel joins human weakness to heavenly authority. Jesus does not escape humanity to receive the kingdom. He brings faithful humanity to its intended goal under God, through the cross, resurrection, and reign of the Son of Man.